Hello everyone, my name's Andy Boakye and I'm a lecturer in religions and theology at the University of Manchester. And to round off this series where we interpret the global pandemic, I'm going to consider one of the most uncertain times in Israel's sacred history, the time of the Babylonian exile at the beginning of the 6th century BC and their subsequent restoration from exile. I'll outline a very brief history of the period, then make a couple of points from the literature that emerged from that period, focusing mainly on Ruth and Esther. So there are three ideas to take away as we think about our post-COVID-19 future within our communities. Firstly, we can't be trapped by our own traditions. Secondly, we ought to pursue a more creative and innovative discipleship. And thirdly, God's love is a certainty, but life is not. The Babylonian captivity is really where Israelite religion began. Before the exile, being a citizen of Judah was the same as worshipping Judah's God. That's why we call it Judaism. It's simply Judah plus ism. It was the worship of the God of the land. Now, in the ancient world, if people were made to move to a new land, either forcibly or voluntarily, they would simply worship the gods of their new land. It was unheard of that they would worship the God of the land that they left. But now that the Judean exiles had become Babylonian citizens, they still continued to worship Yahweh. And this was the beginning of Jewish religion, a faith that wasn't tied to national citizenship. Jews worshipping the God of Israel, but in Babylon. And of course, with the temple being destroyed and no temple to sacrifice animals in, Jews had to adapt. This was when, for example, synagogues first started to appear. But even after the exile had physically ended, Judah was still not independent. They'd been freed by the Persian king Cyrus, but they were now subjects of Persia and had no access to wealth, to royal influence, or to military power. And this sense of powerlessness that they felt was reflected in a new kind of literature that emerged from the period, the so-called short story, of which the most common examples are Ruth, Esther, and an apocryphal book called Judith. Now, you'll notice that the stars of all these books are women. And they're not just women, but women in compromising positions. Ruth was a woman and a foreigner. Esther was a woman and an orphan, and Judith a woman and a widow. And in these narratives, traditionally male values like power and wealth fail. Royal power is almost comically foolish in Esther. Economic power couldn't save Ruth in her situation, and military might is proved to be useless in the book of Judith, but we'll focus mainly on Ruth and Esther. As Jews under foreign rule couldn't exploit royal power, economic or military power, these vulnerable women reflected vulnerable Israel. And yet these women were the heroes of these narratives, and the messages that came from them were of great encouragement to the Jews. These women didn't rely on traditionally male values. They used their wits, their cunning, and even their femininity to achieve God's purposes. And this brings me really to the first point. What do we do when we can't lean on the usual traditions and conventions that we get so used to? The social implications of COVID-19 have showed us that we can't simply rest upon things just because that's the way we've always done them. Luke depicts Peter's attachment to his tradition in Acts 10. Remember the vision of the sheet that unfolded from heaven. Well, we read this. Luke writes, "He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its four corners. In it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, 'Get up, Peter, kill and eat.' But Peter said, 'By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything unclean or profane.' The voice said to him again a second time, 'What God has made clean, you must not call profane.' This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven." That's Acts 10, verses 9 through 16. So Peter has this vision. He's supposed to get up and kill and eat these four-footed animals. And his response is, "Surely not, Lord. I've never eaten anything that's impure or unclean." In other words, Peter held on to the Jewish law so tightly that in the initial instance, not even God could get him to break it. 3 times God had to say to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter's response is, "No, God's law forbids it." And you can almost imagine God's response up there. "Look, mate, I am God. Get up, kill and eat." God was doing something new amongst his people, bringing the message of Jesus to the Gentile world. And yet Peter's attachment to his conventions and Jewish traditions proved a stumbling block to the divine purposes. And it's no wonder that God needed someone with a different, more maverick temperament like Paul to take the message beyond the borders of Israel. But is your attachment today to the way that we've always done things becoming a hindrance? Well, secondly, you all know the story of Ruth. Naomi had two sons who married Moabite women. When her sons died, one of those Moabite women, Ruth, went back with Naomi to Bethlehem. Now, Moab was a sworn enemy of Israel. They were forbidden from worshipping with the community in Deuteronomy 23. And they were held to be descendants of the children that Lot had with his own daughters in Genesis 19. And Ruth is referred to as the Moabite throughout the narrative. Well, she and Naomi hatched this elaborate plot to seduce a wealthy Israelite farmer called Boaz. And they have a son, Boaz and Ruth, and their son's called Obed. And of course, Obed is King David's great-grandfather. So think about this. King David, this quintessential royal Israelite hero, is related to the hated Moabite people. I think the key message of Ruth here is that here you have this woman who is weak and vulnerable, in a vulnerable position. Indeed, in Ruth 2, verse 9, Boaz has to reassure her that he's warned his farmhands not to molest her. That's what a foreign woman in another land could expect. And clearly, this was traumatic. Yet because of her loyalty to Naomi, her wits and her charm, God ordained her to become King David's great-grandmother. So loyalty, wit and charm, achieving God's purposes when power and wealth and clout could not. You see, God's people have always had to be innovators because their journey as God's people took them down some strange roads, some unpredictable avenues with all sorts of twists and turns. And right now, with our movements having been restricted by the virus, key elements of our discipleship to Christ have been forced to operate in very different ways. In a changing world, how might we need to develop and respond? How might our own discipleship need to be more creative? In what ways in the future might we think of serving the community, of serving one another, and perhaps in ways we haven't done before? What new ideas might we develop in this time? Not least of all with the growth, of course, of online churches and the myriad of people who attend online services but would never think of going into a religious worship service otherwise. It seems to me that one of the key questions facing us now is how do we rethink the gospel for a new day without compromising the gospel itself? We often speak about restoring first century Christianity. I'd suggest that in fact we're doing nothing of the sort for the very simple fact this is not the first century. Our early brothers and sisters had their place in God's story, and the reason that we engage with that story is to learn to tell our own 21st century story of what it means to follow Jesus Christ. Every generation of believers has to reflect anew on the gospel message, how to engage with it and how to disseminate it. The gospel itself will never change, but the world is changing all the time and we cannot afford to be left behind. As John Carroll, an Australian sociologist who's not religious, once wrote, from a sociological standpoint, the waning of Christianity that's practiced in the West is easy to explain. The Christian churches have comprehensively failed in this one central task, to retell their foundational story in a way that speaks to the times. And in our TikTok recording, Instagramming, I want it right now, post-Christian, post-truth and post-postmodern times, the church cannot afford to lag behind. Well, finally, Esther. Esther's a tale of weak, vacillating men, namely King Ahasuerus and the Prime Minister Haman, and of strong, courageous women, Vashti and Esther. I'm sure you all know the plot reasonably well. So the king Ahasuerus throws this lavish banquet to show off his queen, Vashti, and she completely refuses to be paraded, causing a national crisis of disobedient wives. And so the king, to replace Vashti, organises an elaborate ancient beauty contest, which was won by this Jewish orphan girl called Esther. Now, in the meantime, the Persian Prime Minister Haman demands homage from all the subjects of Persia, and one person refuses to pay him homage, and that turns out to be Esther's cousin Mordecai. Well, in Haman's outrage, he persuades the king to issue an edict to have Mordecai's people, i.e. the Jews, wiped out. Well, Mordecai convinces Queen Esther to use her wits and to reveal her ethnicity to the king in such a way that the Jews can be saved. Well, like Ruth, this is a short story which reflects an incredibly uncertain time in Israel's post-exilic life. And it's one book in particular which became very popular in Holocaust theology because of the obvious parallels between Haman and Hitler, two people who tried to wipe out the Jews. And yet, even though Esther serves as a basis for such theological discourse, it actually doesn't contain any theology. Esther never mentions God, never mentions Israel, never mentions the covenant or prayer. Now, this was obviously problematic for ancient Jewish communities. Yet from a literary point of view, readers are doing what truth seekers do all the time with the text of Esther. They are looking for God. We read the following in Esther chapter 4. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all of the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have attained royalty for such a time as this." Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Just like Joseph being sold by his brothers, or Pharaoh's obstinance in freeing the Israelites from captivity in Egypt, or Daniel and his colleagues who were in Babylon itself, we see here God working through human decision-making and the taking of responsibility. The author of Esther takes for granted that the Jews will be delivered, inviting readers, of course, to see that God is the one who's doing the delivering, even though God's not mentioned. God's deliverance comes about here because human beings accept responsibility to use the position that they're in and to act in faith and with courage, as Esther had clearly committed herself to doing, even in the face of great risk. Remember Daniel's colleagues in Daniel 3. "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." This is what it means to serve God in uncertainty. Who knows if this is why Esther came to the throne? Again, there's no reference to God having brought her there. That seems to be just a position that's presupposed. But it's not stated because it illustrates the way things often work. We don't always see the hand of God. If I said to you last Christmas that you'd spend months locked behind closed doors for fear of catching a terrible virus that's gripped the entire world, you'd think I was quoting some terrible dystopian novel, and yet here we are. Then again, if someone had told me that my first child would be born 15 weeks prematurely, weighing 1 pound 11 ounces, and be written off by the doctors, I probably wouldn't have believed that either. I doubt I could ever have imagined some of the things that I've gone through. There have been days when my son has brought me more joy than anyone or anything in the world. There are times when I've spent entire days physically restraining him to stop him from destroying our house and from gouging my eyes out in the process. And so the question comes, is any part of life really certain? The answer from experience would be an unambiguous no. God's love is certain, but life is not. The opposite of living by faith is living by certainty. Prosperity preachers promise wealth. There are certain sects who claim to know when the end of the world will be. There are some religious theorists who prescribe karma. They tell you do good things and good things will happen to you. And all these people share one common flaw. They're all wrong. As the author of Ecclesiastes demonstrated, sometimes the hard-working remain poor. No one knows how long they have on planet Earth, and sometimes the bad guys and the bullies win. Faith is what connects us to God. Trusting God and not trusting in certainty and thinking you know what lies around the corner is the basis of discipleship. As we've heard in previous weeks' teaching, we can't be certain about the what's, where's and whys and wherefores about COVID-19. But what if we are in lockdown for such a time as this, when, like Esther, we can reflect upon and rethink how we serve God, what our gifts are, what we're passionate about, what roles we might play in our churches, and how we might connect with our communities. So please take time in the discussion to ask, are there conventions and traditions which you hold to too tightly? Can we, like Esther and Ruth, faithfully and creatively adapt to a changing world to bring about God's purposes? Can we be at peace knowing that life is not always black and white and that unpredictable circumstances might mean that we have to think very differently about how we serve God? I hope a few of the things that I've shared today will help you think through and address those questions. Thank you very much all for listening. God bless you all.